Welcome back to the Lumiose Post, where we talk about all things Pokemon, and today we're going to be talking about Paradox Pokemon, specifically trying to figure out exactly what the timelines that these Paradox Pokemon are from look like. Specifically, we'll be focusing on the Scarlet Paradoxes, so the past Paradoxes, if you will. Where this is all coming from is we know in-game, it has been confirmed now, that Paradox Pokemon are Pokemon from other timelines. So the question is, what do these other timelines look like? We don't know for sure whether or not, they're all coming from the same one. Like, maybe all of the Scarlet Pokemon are in the same timeline, like Great Tusk, Screamtail, Walking Wake, they're all in the same timeline. Or it could even be from different timelines, right? Like, we might have Screamtail is one timeline, Great Tusk is another timeline. Running with that for a moment, we're going to try to figure out what exactly these timelines would look like. Now, we don't have a lot to go off of, because the interesting thing about these Paradox Pokemon is they're very similar to cryptids, right? Like, in our real world, we have Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster. Paradox Pokemon are very similar to that. There are these magazines in the Pokemon world called the Culture magazines, and these have some little theories on what these Pokemon could look like, and the Pokedex will even kind of bring up bits and pieces of the culture books when describing these Pokemon. At the end of the day, there's a lot of like super skeptical stuff in these books. Like, they say, I think the most mind-blowing one to me is that they say that Iron Hands is an athlete that was like cybernetically enhanced after an injury or something to that effect. So it is very likely that the culture books are just full of crap, right? Like, similar to with the Loch Ness Monster, one of the most famous images of it actually is just a piece of driftwood floating in the lake. Or maybe even it's an elephant's trunk, an elephant swimming in like Africa, and someone took a picture of it and said it was the Loch Ness Monster in Scotland. Things like that happen all the time. This is what these culture books represent. It's someone seeing something that they couldn't quite explain, so they explained it as best they could, because how do you explain something that has never been a thing before? It's unexplainable, right? So that's what they're supposed to represent, but I believe in having fun here at the Lumiose Post, so we're going to look at, based on these culture books, what happened in those timelines, how those timelines are different from the current one we play in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Now, furthermore, we'll also be talking about the survivability rate of this timeline, like if humans could make it in this timeline. And when I say that, I mean that in comparison to the Pokemon world, because to be frank with you, if we're talking about humans like you and me, in our world, well, if we were all moved to the Pokemon world, we would all be screwed, right? Because the animals breathe fire there. So this is going to be looking at, if you took a trainer from the Pokemon world and put them in this timeline, what are their odds looking like? Let's get into it with the first of the Paradox Pokemon in the Pokedex, and that is Great Tusk. So all we know about Great Tusk is that it's supposed to be a Donphan that is super, super old, like it's an ancient form of Donphan. So what I'm assuming here is this one's actually the most simple one, and it's just that Donphan never evolved. Now, if we look at the real world, the big extinction of the mammoths actually likely came from the early humans, so it's very possible that that's a similar thing with Great Tusk. You do notice that Great Tusk has a lot of fur on it, so I imagine that its evolution to Donphan is kind of similar to like just the mammoths being wiped out and elephants still being a thing today. And if that's the case, I'm imagining that this timeline has no humans. This is a timeline where humanity never evolved, whether that be because Neanderthals were killed off by Pokemon before ever evolving into humans, or if, maybe even Neanderthals didn't exist. I don't know, but either way, I would say that this timeline, that's all it is just humans didn't exist in it. So obviously, the survivability rate of it for a human is 0, because very likely the environment would not be suitable for a human, as humans never got to exist there. Next, we have Screamtail, and Screamtail actually might be my favorite of all of these. So the thing about Screamtail is it just simply states that it is like a super ancient Jigglypuff. It actually specifically states that it is a Jigglypuff from like 1 billion years ago. Again, this is all, just kind of fan writing, really, if I'm honest, in the Pokemon world. But that's what we're going to work with. If it's a Jigglypuff from 1 billion years ago, there's actually a decent chance that this is a timeline where the first Pokemon was not Mew. And Now, I know a lot of you are going to say, the first Pokemon's not Mew, it's Arceus. And yeah, what I mean is, the way I look at it is, there's Arceus was the first. He created the universe. He created Pokemon to hold up the universe, right? Like Dialga, Palkia to hold up time and space. Giratina, of course, was created along with them. And then even the Lake Spirits were likely created pretty early on for emotion and willpower and knowledge to exist. But then he created Mew, and over time, Mew became, well, every single Pokemon. And so what I imagine is that in this timeline, instead of creating Mew first, Arceus create Jigglypuff first, or rather, Screamtail. Screamtail does have a lot of similarities to Mew if you look at it. It does have that tail that kind of curls up in a similar way to Mewtwo, which obviously gets its DNA from Mew. And also, it does gain the Psychic typing, which is a typing that Mew has. So I imagine that just in this timeline, Screamtail was the first Pokemon ever. Like, you know, instead of Mew, it was Screamtail as the ancestor to all Pokemon. What would Pokemon look like in that timeline? I have no idea. That's a wild thought. But I think that's where Screamtail's coming from. The survivability rate of this one would be, I would say, 90 to 100, because if we can make it in the Pokemon world, I imagine we could make it in this one. I mean, this is slightly less threatening of a Mew, in my opinion, so I think that we're fine, but yeah, we'll leave it 90 to 100 just in case. Brute Bonnet is really interesting because it talks about how it is a mixture, a combination of a fungus and a dinosaur. So I imagine that in this timeline, what happened is a fungus basically took over dinosaurs and kind of eventually just started creating like dinosaur fungus mutants. We actually do know of a Pokemon that could point us to what this fungus was. The Pokemon line Paris and Parasect, they have a fungus that takes over them. In fact, if you look at their designs, Parasect is like completely dead. Like its eyes are blank, there's no pupils, nothing, unlike with Paris. And the mushroom is a lot bigger. That fungus has taken over it. So I imagine this timeline, that mushroom was able to evolve quicker and was able to take over actual dinosaurs. Not just little bugs, but actual dinosaurs. And eventually this just kind of led to this fungus taking over everything. Think like The Last of Us. And now everything walking around is a fungus, including the dinosaurs, and that's what Brute Bonnet is. It's one of these dinosaur fungus hybrids. If you wanted to, you could even say that this could be proof that this mushroom, rather, is closely related to fungus in our timeline, given the similarities between Brute Bonnet and Amoonguss. I would say that's safe to say that in our timeline, the Paris fungus is closely related to fungus and Amoonguss. And if I'm not mistaken, Birdkeeper Toby, who's like the leading expert on Pokemon evolution, had it there on his evolutionary tree as well, that they were pretty closely connected. Now, of course, we're looking at a timeline where fungus has taken over everything. Fungi, if you will, has taken over everything. I don't think humans are surviving this. I'm giving this a survivability rate of 0. Now, Flutter Mane is also a really interesting one because the only thing that we're told about Flutter Mane is that it seems like it's the ghost of a pterosaur. I don't know if y'all have seen Flutter Mane. I'm not seeing the pterosaur vibes from this. I never at any point looked at this thing and thought, oh, that's a pterosaur. No, it doesn't look remotely like a pterosaur for me, but whatever. We're going to roll with this. I'm imagining that since it's a ghost pterosaur, we're seeing a similar thing to Galarian Corsola, where basically because of pollution and stuff, Corsola died out and became a ghost type in the Galar region, and that's why we have Galarian Corsola and its evolution Cursola. So similarly, I would say this is a timeline where humans and dinosaurs coexisted, and humans actually managed to overhunt and possibly even drive to extinction the pterosaur, or whatever the equivalent to a pterosaur is in the Pokemon world. They now are ghost type, just like how Corsola becomes ghost type, and that gives us Flutter Mane. I imagine that given that we're living in the same time as dinosaurs, our survivability rate would be lower, but since in this hypothetical timeline we managed to overhunt and even drive to extinction one of the dinosaurs, I'm giving us a pretty high survivability rate. I'm going to say 70 to 80%. Now we have Slither Wing. Slither Wing is described as an ancient Volcarona. So what do we do here? We just clearly say that this is a timeline where Volcarona never learned to fly, or never needed to fly, rather. And, you know, we can get into why we think that Volcarona never needed to fly. Larvesta is an incredibly rare Pokemon. In fact, in the Unova region, which was the region that debuted Larvesta, you have two opportunities to get a Larvesta. You can get a Larvesta egg, or you can get a Volcarona in the, like, desert ruins, like in the last chamber of the desert ruins. And so, you know, it's pretty rare, right? For some random hiker on an island to give you an egg, or for it to be practically buried under the sand in the desert of Unova, it has to be a pretty rare Pokemon. And so I'm going to say that since it was so rare, it was likely because of humans that it became extinct. Now, whether this was from overhunting or even from just population, like environment destroying, like tearing down forests and stuff to build cities, I don't know, but something with humans, I would say, drove Larvesta to have to become Volcarona and have to kind of get the ability to fly to and be drove out to extinction, or near extinction, endangerment rather. I apologize. So I imagine that in this timeline, humans didn't overhunt Larvesta. Perhaps this is a timeline where humans better understand the relationship between them and the world earlier on, and they don't overhunt, they don't deforest, none of that. And so Larvesta's Volcarona evolution is actually Slither Wing. It never needed to learn to fly, and it stayed on the ground just like Larvesta. Sandy Shocks is really cool because it says it was a Magneton that lived for 10,000 years. Now, I don't know about y'all, but 10,000 years seems like a long time for me. To put that into perspective for our world, 2,000 years ago was like the Roman Empire. So 10,000 is too far back for me to even know what was there. So, that being said, this has to be something crazy going on with this Sandy Shocks. Perhaps someone created a device that could give this Magneton eternal life. Wait, actually, in the original timeline of Pokemon, there is someone who did that. Of course, AZ had a Floette that passed away during a war, and he created the ultimate weapon to basically wipe out everything, but also to bring Floette back to life. Now, I imagine that in this timeline where Sandy Shocks is from, something similar occurred, but the beloved Pokemon was not a Floette, but a Magneton. Does that mean that this Magneton is AZ's Floette? Maybe, but I wouldn't say definitely. I would just say that it's possible that this is just a Magneton that someone loved. It could not be AZ. It could just be like a mad scientist. You know, Chorus does have a Magnezone. Maybe it's a timeline where Chorus did it with his Magneton. I don't know. But yeah, I would say that someone like resurrected this Sandy Shocks. And now that I see this too, that's been alive for 10,000 years is what it says. I do kind of look at Sandy Shocks, and I can kind of get some Frankenstein vibes from it, right? So perhaps that's what happened. It died and was brought back to life. Then we have Roaring Moon. I'd love to say that Roaring Moon is something absolutely absurd, but I actually don't think it is. I think that Roaring Moon is a early version of Salamence. I think Roaring Moon does exist in the main timeline of Pokemon and just is long lost to the past. So I'm imagining that what happened here is that if Roaring Moon still exists in the present, Salamence never had to go into caves. So likely Bagon and Shelgon never even existed too. They always were just adapted to the sky. Roaring Moon never had to go into its cave. That could be from humans again, or it could just simply be from some kind of predator, or even, you know, prey. Like if prey that Salamence is used to catching then reverts into caves, it's got to start adapting to caves if it still wants that prey. So there's a number of factors, but I think just the bottom line of it is that Roaring Moon never had to adapt to caves. It always was just a flyer. Coridon is another really interesting one because it is basically a dinosaur, right? So I'm assuming that Coridon comes from a timeline where the dinosaurs were never wiped out. Now, I don't know if it's ever been stated that an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs in the Pokemon world, but given that is the leading theory on why they were wiped out here in the real world, I'm going to assume that a similar or the same thing happened in the Pokemon world, and that's what wiped out Coridon, and I imagine that instead that didn't happen. You could also propose that Cyclizar is just a domesticated version of Coridon, so perhaps Cyclizar was just never domesticated in this timeline, so there are no Cyclizar, there's only these wild Coridon. Makes sense, right? Like, you know, there are some Pokemon that aren't domesticated, like Aggron. Aggron's not really a domesticated Pokemon. We've never really domesticated it. So could be a similar thing here where Cyclizar was never domesticated, so it just stayed a Coridon, never had to evolve. And last but certainly not least, we have the Paradox Beast. Now, I do imagine that these three, just because they're so heavily tied together, both, you know, in their original forms, Raikou, Suicune, and Entei, and also in these Paradox forms, Walking Wake, Raging Bolt, and Gouging Fire. Since they're all connected, I imagine these actually are from the same timelines, and they're just simply from a timeline where the original Pokemon that these were reptiles. So, to clarify what I mean here, Entei, Raikou, and Suicune were not always Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. They were these other Pokemon that then died in the burning of the now burned tower, and were resurrected by Ho-Oh as Suicune, Entei, and Raikou. I imagine a similar thing happened with Walking Wake, Raging Bolt, and Gouging Fire. Now, since it was further back, I imagine it was a different kind of disaster. It wasn't the burning of the burned tower, the now burned tower, but something else entirely. And the original Pokemon that died in it were not mammals, because we do see in evolutions, I believe, that they are depicted as mammals. It's either evolutions or generations, but it looks like Entei, Raikou, and Suicune are depicted as mammals before they died. They look like these dog-like creatures. So I'm imagining just in this timeline, they weren't. They were some reptile creatures that died in there. So they were resurrected as Walking Wake, Raging Bolt, and Gouging Fire. There you have it, guys. Be sure to let me know what you think of this video. If this video does really well, I'd love to visit the Violet Paradoxes and give them their own video on what their timelines could look like. It's definitely a fun thought, right? Like, this is like the Pokemon equivalent of What If, the Marvel show, you know, where they like, oh, what if this had happened? That's it. I think my favorite timeline of these would have to be where Screamtail is the first Pokemon and not Mew. That is a crazy thought, and I absolutely love it. But be sure to let me know what you think in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so you don't miss all of our future videos. And until next time, I will see all of you later.